I don't know if you've been in a situation that was hopeless. And the more you tried to do things to fix it, it almost felt like the worse it got. There was nothing you could say, there was nothing you could do, there was nothing you could give that seemed to help it along. And you know what's ironic is Christmas for us is a time of joy, but 2,000 years ago, it was actually that hopeless situation. We were 1,000,000 miles away from God and absolutely dead as we stood. It's just that God is able to do things that we can't. He's able to give things that we can't. He's able to step into situations that are impossible and suddenly they become possible. And so this Christmas, God has given us a gift that's found at a pretty unique intersection. Right at the intersection of our inability and His ability. You actually might be able to say it's here at the corner of depravity and holiness. Good morning. Hello. Merry Christmas. Hello, Hesperia, Phelan, Apple Valley, and Victorville. Gosh, we are so very glad to have you in church with us. Very glad to be able to move through this Christmas series, Street Corners. And it is a look at the different things that God allows to intersect in human history so that He can achieve what He wants to achieve in our lives. And this weekend, we're going to look at the intersection of depravity and holiness. We'd like to move you through a story, give you some things to think about. So if you came into our rooms and you don't have notes, raise your hand. We'll give you some notes so that you can track along with what God is doing, because normally you wouldn't blend the ideas of depravity and holiness together. But they are right at home in the Christmas story. They are right at home in the redemption story. They're right at home in the story we're going to talk through this weekend as well. I'm very glad to be part of the Christmas series because it's all leading towards Christmas Eve. And if you've been around HDC for at least 12 and a half months, you know that we kind of exploded Christmas with a lot of pride, gratitude, joy, and awe about what God does. And this series is aimed at preparing our hearts so that we're ready for the real meaning of Christmas at Christmas Eve. It's not about what are we going to do to top last year. That's not important. It's about what can we do to just burst with pride about what God has done in our lives. And the second thing is that we want to be able to burst out into our oikos, into our world, and tell them, you've got to be a part of what's happening at my church this Christmas Eve. So as we walk towards that end, we want to move you guys into week 2 of this series. And Jesus makes 7 statements in the Gospel of John about who He is. And He frames those 7 statements in a creative way and in a clarifying way. Pastor Tom talked us through the beginning of those statements last weekend. We're not going to hit all 7. We're just going to hit a couple. This weekend, it's from the 8th chapter of John, verse 12. Jesus says that when He spoke again to the people, He said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." It's a bold statement because you and I have been walking with God for years now. And there are times when it feels like I'm walking in darkness. And God made me the promise that if I walk with him, I'll never walk in darkness. And so hopefully the story that we're gonna move us through will clarify what the promise of God is for my life and what God can do in my oikos as well. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of framework before we get to the story, okay? And it is the political makeup of the first century world, all right? We're gonna read a story that happened 1980 years ago. And as I mentioned that this weekend, I thought, man, it's so weird that there are a lot of people in our church that don't even know the 1980s. Like, you don't understand that Michael Jackson's Thriller album came out in the 80s. And by the way, when you bought an album, you didn't click a button. You bought an album, like at Tower Records, and then whatever, okay. 1980 years ago, though, there was a story that happened. There's a good guy in the story that we're all gonna cheat and skip to the end, and you can't do that in the story because it takes away why the story's important. There are good guys in the story named the Pharisees. And the reason that they're the good guys in the story is because of what was happening in first century Israel. The Romans had conquered the known world, and they had an interesting way of ruling. They just wanted a couple of things to be true. They wanted you to not fight against them militarily. That was dumb, you would lose anyway. And number two, they wanted your financial loyalty. You would pay taxes to them. And honestly, if you could live by those two rules, things were okay for you. You were allowed to keep your customs, your traditions, your language, your religion. They didn't really care about that stuff. They wanted your money and they wanted to dominate. And so for the Jewish people, they were allowed to keep an awful lot of their culture intact. They were allowed to keep their traditions, custom, language, and religion. But man, for the Jewish people, it was such a big deal that they were not free. The history of their people was hung on the hat that God called Abram out and made him his own people. So they were already unique in the very beginning of their nation. And then another defining moment of pride for them is when God delivered them out from the Egyptians under the leadership of Moses. The freedom of God's people was a big deal. The autonomy, the leadership that they had over themselves was a big deal. And you and I actually feel a little bit of that frustration of freedom when we're in situations where we should be in charge and we're not. Case number one, have you ever argued with a 4-year-old? You have, haven't you? And it's the most crazy thing in the world that you're thinking in your head, and you would never act on this thought, and you would never say this thought, but I'm gonna say it for you. You're arguing with a 4-year-old, and you're thinking, I am literally 6 times bigger than you. I could end this right now. But instead you engage, and you're frustrated with the fact that you should be in charge, but you're not. And some of you used to work at a place where you're frustrated with the boss. Oh man, this is just so dumb. And then you became a boss, didn't you? And now you're frustrated with who? The employees. Like, oh, if they just listen to me. Nobody's ever happy. No one's ever in charge. And for the Jewish people, the Pharisees were the group of people who were as high up as it got, and they were frustrated because it was their job to keep the purity of God's people intact. The godless Romans were in charge, and it sure felt like God wasn't keeping all of his promises he'd made to Abram and to Moses, that he would be their God and they would be his people. And they felt the burden of expectation that I represent God to all the people, and we all know that God's not in charge right now, but Caesar is. And I also feel the burden that as I lead these people, I'm nervous that if we don't do everything God says we have to do, if we aren't living life perfectly, then we shouldn't expect God to be faithful to us. You understand that that was a tough spot to hold. On one hand, it was the pinnacle because it was the most prestige and historical office you could hold at that point in their history, but there was a lot of pressure in it too. And the group was a little testy, to say the least. And the role that they held was to teach people what God wanted and to enforce it as well. They were the legislative and judicial branch, and they wanted the executive power too. In our story this weekend, we're gonna watch them claw towards control in a world that they had lost control of. I wanna read you guys a story, and then we'll work through it in chunks, okay? John 8, verse 2. At dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. They were having church. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group. church just got weird. People bolt in the back doors, and they bring up a woman who they caught in the act of adultery, which is already weird, right? And then they bring her up in the front of the church, and then all of a sudden they're yelling at the teacher, okay? They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commands us to stone such women. What do you think?" Church just got weirder. They were using this question as a trap. It's a trap. It comes out on Friday, okay? I couldn't help myself. They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. And they kept on questioning him, and he straightened up and he said to them, "Okay, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And at this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time. The older ones left first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir." "Then neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin." It's a story that's good enough on its own. Really, honestly, I should shut up and pray and be done. But there are such neat things to pull out of what's happening in this story. I need to explain to you guys why the Pharisees start off as the good guys. I need to explain to you guys that it's really ironic that there's juxtaposition at the end of the story with what Jesus says and who's there. We need to move through it. But let's start with the hero, okay? The hero of the story is different than who you think it is. You're cheating. You're 2,000 years after the fact. If we were able to step into the story at the beginning, we would all already be assuming that the Pharisees were the heroes of the story. Matter of fact, let's move through it. Give me that first chunk of the story right here. Verses 2-6. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people were gathered before him, and he sat down to teach. And the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in the act of adultery. Now, let's just stop about that fact for a second, okay? You're probably thinking, "Oh, wait a second, Tim, honestly, if I'm thinking about this story, this is creeper status times 10. This is not Facebook stalking. Why were they around so that they could catch a woman in the act of adultery?" Now, this is church and it's Christmas time, and we're gonna be polite and delicate in how we handle this, but you've gotta be relatively close to the situation if you're gonna catch someone in the act of adultery, right? Let alone, why are a group of religious leaders around in that situation? Well, let me explain it to you guys this way. In our culture, we have layers of leadership that keep us away from unsavory portions of culture, right? And if someone gets arrested in a drug deal, we don't suddenly stop and think, "Wait a second, if there was a drug deal happening, why are there police officers around? Because police officers are the good guys and the drug dealers are the bad guys." We don't think that way, right? Now, I know that the media likes to scare us so that we become addicted to their coverage. I know that. And I know that they will erode any layer of our culture in an effort to get us to be addicted to what they're saying. And they're constantly going to erode away how do Christians interact in our culture, how do politicians act in our culture, how do the police interact in our culture. Listen, I've been in a lot of countries around this world. I have an awful lot of faith in our police force. And I understand, and I want to acknowledge that there are situations that get ugly. But honestly, I still believe that the police are the good guys. And in our culture, we don't freak out when police operate in a way, we can do what we want. We don't, watch this though. I'm trying to build back to this. We don't freak out when police are in an unsavory situation because we trust them to govern those situations, right? This is not weird in this situation. The Pharisees had the burden of keeping God's people in line, otherwise God would not bless them. So they've got to step into situations like this. And as a matter of fact, they are creating an ugly scene because the woman has done something ugly. Now, she's very winsome in the story because of the way Jesus interacts with her. But before that, guys, let's just be very blunt. If someone dragged someone into church that had been sleeping with your spouse, they're not a winsome character in the story, are they? They're not. She had destroyed a marriage. And so the Pharisees put on their back, we'll handle this in a way that we know needs to be handled and we know how it needs to be handled. Write this down, okay, in your notes. The law prescribed death as a punishment. These are the good guys and they know the law. They know the penal code. They're a police officer in this sense. And as a matter of fact, throw up Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10 on our screen. The Bible says if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. Is this verse confusing? No, it's unsettling, but it is not confusing. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. Who's involved? What happened? What should happen as a result? I mean, it's straightforward. And then we read the story, and they found an adulteress caught in the act, and what else do you want to do? I don't even know what to say. You see, this is what made the Pharisees the presumed heroes in the story. It's like they are holiness and she is depravity. And the intersection is going to force Jesus to ask this question: what street do you live on, Jesus? Are you depraved like her? Because you're really popular with the people. You keep siding with them. But I'll tell you right now, Jesus, we are trying to stand up for holiness. And so if you want to stand on that street, you've got to side with us. How could someone do such an ugly thing and think that it would work as a trap? Because of the law. The people looked up to this group as the group who knew right and wrong, and as the group who would weigh out right and wrong. And it says in the scriptures that if a man commits adultery, both he and the woman are to be put to death. So once again, the Pharisees make the tough call, and they keep the people pure before God. Someone has to do the dirty work. After all, this is what separates them from the godless Romans. It is what pulls their deep history into present day. And maybe if they keep their end of the bargain, at some point God will keep his, and they'll be free again. The scene is ugly. But the Pharisees were the one who tried to make the best of a bad situation. They would do what was right to restore purity back to the people. They would pull them into holiness if it cost them. Now, do you see how they could think that the Pharisees are the good guys? How hard would it be to live purely if you were ruled in a culture that was so doggone impure, right? It's hard, isn't it? With access to what all the internet provides us, with the constant pleads from Nike and Audi and Pepsi and Coke to keep investing our money in products that'll make us happy, to be caught up in the 24-hour news cycle that likes to tear people down, and then to build little idols to ourselves on Facebook and Instagram. I mean, how hard is it to live purely in a world that's not pure? What other possible answer is there for situations like this than to do what the Pharisees did and to blast somebody for being depraved? The marvel of all this is Jesus. When all options are bad options, he steps in. When our plans are bad plans, he steps in. So let's read some more of the story. Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first. Throw a stone." And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. There's a word for that if you're the woman. And, it's not really a bad word. It's just not a word that we say in church, but that stunk if you're that woman, right? Because the Pharisees are pure and holy, and she's depraved, and Jesus is stuck, and he steps down, and he's writing some stuff in the ground, and then he stands up and he speaks, and he sure seems to side with the Pharisees, huh? Hey, here we go. Matter of fact, you guys are right. Let's do this. I got a plan. I got a plan. Whoever is without sin, grab a rock. Let's begin. Stoning is an ugly practice, and her heart sank. I tell you that right now. And can you imagine if you came to church and we were talking about sin and depravity, and how depravity is this? It's rebellion against God. It's death that lives in your mind, in your emotions, and in your will. And now it's not just inside of you, but you act on it. And I know that most of the time you probably don't. Let's say that 75% of the time you do not act on the death that is inside of you. But man, sometimes you do. And so we're teaching about this, and I'm like, I got a great illustration. And then I called your name. And we bring you up on stage and like, I hate this church. What's going on? This is terrible. And then, we're talking and like, there's God's grace and stuff. But then, I turn around and I say, but hey, let's talk about the issues in your life. Let's talk about the sin that you deal with. And matter of fact, we all get to judge you in just a minute. Just a minute though, just a minute. You're sitting there and you're thinking, this is awful. This is terrible. This is not good. Well, she's in a little bit worse spot than your reputation because Jesus just said, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone. Yeah. But a good teacher steps in. And he was pulled into an ugly scene that was going to trap him. It was a no-win situation. And he would have to side with the Pharisees. He'd have to say this, right? Because what are his options? Option number one, he wants to be gracious towards this woman, and so he disagrees with the scriptures. The law said something very clear. And so Jesus, if he's going to be gracious, because that's what he preached about, right? Love and forgiveness and reconciliation. Instead of saying that, he was going to have to say, all right, I disagree with the Bible, and he would lose his credibility. He would lose it. There would be no more authority that he would have to teach the people. So option one is bad. He can't do that. Option two is he sides with the Pharisees, and he looks subservient to them. He looks ugly like them, and he loses a lot of favor with the people. And so the Pharisees are thinking, finally, this young punk teacher is going to have to fall back into line. And for about a minute there, we felt like maybe he was something different. But honestly, this situation is going to prove that he's got to fall into the same line that we are holding everyone into. But there are reasons that we call Jesus good. And at the base, at the very foundation of why we call Jesus good is his holiness. Jesus is absolute purity, and his holiness is the complete absence of sin. It is the absence of depravity, but it is the presence of absolute goodness. Do you know somebody who's just good? And when you see them or you hear of them, you can't think they are just good. Jesus is absolute goodness. He is absolute wisdom. He's never confused, he's never disarmed, he's never wondering. He's absolute wisdom, and he's absolute strength. Holiness is such a big concept. And you know what's ironic is that Jesus always interacted with people who are depraved. The Pharisees think that he's gonna be off guard because of how messed up this woman is and how good they are. And Jesus, what street are you gonna live on, depravity or holiness? Pick a side. And Jesus is like, are you kidding me? I've always interacted with people who are depraved. That's every day, all day, everyone, always. Because I alone am holy and everyone else has depravity at work within them. So the fact that he reacts well in this situation isn't a surprise at all. The ability to react well is buried as deeply in him as his holiness was buried. It's just there. Jesus was not more moral than the woman. That's what the Pharisees were thinking. Well, we're better than her. Jesus was pure. He was holy. And that holiness allowed him to interact in a perfect way. So instead of answering right away before he said what he said, he stooped. And there's certainly poetic beauty in that posture, right? Because Philippians chapter 2 says that he humbled himself to a body on Christmas. Christmas Day is the first stoop in Jesus' life. It won't be the last though, because he stooped this day. And the beauty of the theology in Philippians teaches that his stooping low won't even end on Christmas, and it won't end on this day when he's in the dirt. He's gonna stoop lower and allow himself and even encourage Judas to betray. And then he's gonna stoop again, and he's gonna be brought before a mock of a trial. And then he's gonna stoop again, and he's gonna allow people to beat him. And then he's gonna stoop again, and he's gonna be condemned. And then he's gonna stoop again, and he's gonna be hung on a cross, and he's gonna stoop one last time into a grave. And the story tells us that as he stooped, he wrote, and then he stood. And then he said the most perfect thing that could be said. He said that anyone without sin could begin the stoning. Now we know that this is a clever response, but in the moment it was visceral. The woman would be hopeless now. Jesus had approved the stoning. And in doing so, she was dead. But in doing so, Jesus had actually done a rather remarkable thing. He had turned on a light. He clarified what centuries of Jewish law were actually about. You can write this down. The law teaches us about depravity. Jesus begins to clarify what was actually always clear. It was always clear in the Old Testament scriptures, and Jesus is actually going to absolutely affirm Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. But Galatians chapter 3, verses 10, 11, 12, and 13 clarify things for us in a way that turns on a light. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, as it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. That's really important for this story. Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Isn't that an interesting contrast to what's happening in the scene? Pharisees are the good guys, she's the bad guy. Jesus, Leviticus says, we got to stone her. What do you say? Oh, that's a good question. And he starts to write things down. Jesus knows this is also an important part of God's plan. Cursed is everyone who doesn't continue to do everything in the book of the law. So the first part, cursed is everyone. Who's in the situation? Well, Pharisees and her. Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything that is written. So what does Jesus start to do? He starts to write. What does he write in the dirt? I do not know. Does he start to write down other commandments though? Maybe commandments that the Pharisees struggled with. Maybe none of them were adulterers. Good for them. But maybe they struggled with other things. And maybe what if I grabbed a laptop here and I start to type things onto the screen that are specific things that you struggle with? Not vague things like, hey, be careful with how you treat other people with your words because you're called to build them up. Not like, hey, be careful in how you handle your sexual purity. Not, hey, you know what, why don't you honor God with your finances? No, I start typing in some really specific things. I don't put your name. But I start typing in, hey, be careful how you handle the secretary in this department at this site, at this building. Because if you're starting to entertain the idea of flirting with that individual, boy, that's gonna really get the hairs on the back of your neck to stand up, isn't it? What if I write down, hey, be careful in how you handle this mortgage company with this monthly mortgage payment that are specifically yours, and I don't put your name, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, church just got weird. I don't know what Jesus wrote, but one of the possibilities is he's writing down other commandments from the law that he knows full well that these men struggle with. And all of a sudden, he's raising the level of accountability in the room. And he's like, okay, well, let's remember that cursed is everyone who doesn't do everything in the book. If this is the way you want to live your life, gentlemen, then let's do it. Because if you're going to be about, oh, I'm acting better than you're acting, then you better act better. Not just better, you better act best. Because cursed is everyone who does not do everything written in the book. Maybe it's not that he wrote down commandments. What if he wrote down names, reminding them that they're individuals? They're not part of this group that they just get lumped into Pharisees. What if he's writing down names in the dirt? As if to remind them, you're an individual before God as well. How is your life before God? How are your actions, thoughts, attitudes, behaviors, and emotions before God? Clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God, because the righteous will live by faith. This is from the Old Testament. Galatians is quoting Old Testament scripture. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, it says the person who does these things will live by them. Christ redeemed us from that curse by becoming a curse for us. You've got options, Pharisees. One, you can be better than her, but if that's the path you're choosing, you've got to be best. You have to be pure. Because if you don't do everything God has called you to, then there is depravity at work in you as well. And so if that's the path you're choosing, I'm going to remind you by what I stoop down to write, either maybe your name or other commandments, we do not know. But what Jesus did is he raised the level of accountability in the room to include the room. And the Pharisees are handling the situation just like you and I do. We want accountability to be affecting everyone except for me. Everyone in the room except for me. And so if I mistreat my wife, I'm justified because I had a bad day, or because she did something wrong, or because she just doesn't get it. But all of a sudden now when she is disrespectful to me, oh my gosh, it's like the world ends. And we're allowed to treat people poorly in the workplace, but man, if they talk about us, well, that's not fair. They're a bad person. If you're good 93% of your life and only 7% of the time you mess up, you define yourself on what's good. But if someone else is only evil towards you 2% of their interaction with you, you define them as bad. You're in the room and you're on the side of the Pharisees and you want to define that she's wrong and you're right. And Jesus is saying, bro, if that's the way you want to play this game, the light is on all of us. And that almost seems like, wow, Jesus, that's a little harsh. It's not harsh because of what we're given. You see, Jesus stepped in to remind them that their actions were not able. And that's a good thing because we've got a good God. The question in this is, if they couldn't do what they believed they needed to do, then what can be done? Guys, let's remember this, that she had broken up a marriage, she had killed it. But man, if I'm not allowed to do something about this, what? I don't even, we're broken, we're depraved. We have death at work inside of us and it spills out into the world around us. And our actions alone cannot fix it. We feel anger toward the Pharisees in the story and we use the same logic in our lives that they do. I can control depravity with actions. I can control my brokenness by destroying others who are broken. And we perpetuate depravity unless we do what Jesus offers. Let's continue the story. Back to John chapter 8. So again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, excuse me, ma'am, where are they? Has no one condemned you? Oh man. You got to talk to Jesus in that moment? That's hard. And she just says, no one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. There are a lot of interactions of depravity and holiness. First interaction is when we stepped away in the garden. God had created a perfect world, created us for life, for eternity, for relationship, and we stepped away. And when God calls out, Adam, where are you? It's the first intersection, depravity and his holiness. Then he speaks to Eve and he promises her Christmas. And he says, you know what? I will redeem you back from this through my seed. And so for hundreds of years, for centuries, there's separation. We were left in our depravity. God was removed in his holiness, and he speaks into the situation, promising the next intersection, the next street corner. And the next one is his birth. And Jesus is born. Part of the Christmas story is the virgin birth, right? An absolutely impossible to get away from important piece of the story, because God is able to move in such a way that Jesus enters our world as we are, yet without sin. And so now as a baby with shepherds, he's holy and they're depraved. As a toddler with the wise men who come, he's holy and they're depraved. As a 13-year-old boy, do you know how uncomfortable it is to interact with 13-year-old boys? They just generally smell. And as a 13-year-old boy, Jesus is pure and we are depraved. And so this interaction of his life of holiness and depravity is happening and happening and happening, except for the fact that, man, there's gonna be an even sharper interaction of depravity and holiness. What Jesus offered was redemption. Ironically, he was the only one on the scene who could have picked up a stone. And he's now the one asking her the question, where are your accusers? Is there no one left to condemn you? The only one in the room qualified to condemn her is the one who's left. Everyone else wasn't qualified. The law is right, that our depravity separates us from God. If you are apart from God, you are depraved and you have death. It's at work in you and you are moving towards death. It's just that, wait a second, why would the only one qualified in the room to condemn stop and ask the question. It sure seems like even though in his qualification to condemn, he's choosing something else. And this sharp interaction of holiness and depravity is now pointed right at her, and he chooses to stoop. He chooses to be humble. Romans 8:3 says this, "For what the law was powerless to do, because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. And so he condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law can be fully met in us who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." I don't know that I had you write it down, but I'll have you write this down. This is the last thing we're going to say. Jesus became sin so that we could become holy. Jesus became sin so that we could become holy. And I know it's very uncomfortable to say Jesus became sin, and it sure kind of seems like that Romans 8 passage teaches that, right? That the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, but God did by sending his Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering, and so he condemned sin in the flesh. As a matter of fact, Paul says it to the church at Corinth a little bit more bluntly this way, 2 Corinthians 5:21. "God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that we could become the righteousness of God." The last intersection of holiness and depravity was on the cross, where Jesus said, "I am holy, and so what I choose to do is bring in, I adopt, I take on your sin, knowing full well that it will absolutely infect me and the result will be death for me." And so now in the grave, Jesus' holiness swallows up our sin. And now because of the abundance of his holiness, your sin is absolved. It is gone. And his holiness overcomes. And then secondly, his divinity, his strength is stronger than death. The abundance of the strength of the Son of God says, I'm done with death. I'm past that. And I move beyond it because my strength is abundant, my purity is abundant, and now the last question about the intersection of depravity and holiness rests with you. Where do you stand? What street do you live on? Because I'll tell you right now, as you interact with the Son of God, you are able to make a decision. And if you are at a crossroads, as a believer, choose to live. Choose to live in the holiness that God gives you. Well, how do I do that? I don't understand. I don't know what it means to be holy. I know I'm forgiven, but what does it mean to be holy? On a regular basis, return to that God who has an abundance of holiness. The habit is called confession. I mean, if you want to say it that way, and not in a way that calls you to be like submissive to a bunch of other people. No. Interact with your God in prayer. Confess those things because the abundance of his holiness covers it. And then the abundance of his strength pours into you, and we might become the righteousness of God. We are geeked up every Christmas Eve because we are radically proud of who God is. It's just this, that the credibility of our invitation is hung up on how much you as a believer pursue holiness. We know God is compelling. That part's settled. But when you invite your world to come, when you invite your oikos into our buildings to hear about him, God's credibility is limited by your desire and willingness to pursue a holy life. And so as a believer, you've got to pursue it. As a matter of fact, write these two things down. That if you don't believe, you got to make a decision today. You really just do. Where do you stand with God? And if you do believe, choose him every day. Stop acting like a Pharisee. Go to him. He's good for it. Ephesians 3. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ throughout all generations, forever and ever. Believer, his holiness rests on you. You are made right with God. You do not fear death. You do not fear condemnation. Jesus steps in, and out of his abundance, he gives. Merry Christmas. And if you are an unbeliever, out of the abundance of his holiness, he invites you into the family as well. He wants you with him forever. The call is yours. Father, I am very humble before you because situations like this story, I wrestle with. Who's right? Who's wrong? How can I look good in it? How can I be right? How can I protect myself? And then Jesus, this falls in front of you, and out of your holiness, our depravity is made right. And so God, as a church, as believers, Father, I pray that you would help us to continually choose you. Father, I pray that we would own up to the fact that we've got to return to you, and we would lay down the weapons of this world, and we would not solve our depravity by arguing or slander or trying to prove that we're better. God, help us to return to you. We have the opportunity to read your word, to pray to you, to worship, to hear from you in church, and to be in relationship with believers. And God, I pray that we would take up those disciplines and that your holiness would be at work in your church. God, help us to not be a church of 10,000 people that never pursues holiness. God, you're too compelling for that. So help us to be credible. And if you're in the room or you're watching in another one of our rooms and you've never given your life to Christ, I'm gonna be very straightforward with you right now. You've gotta make a decision now. You need to choose where you stand with God. And I'm gonna tell you this, that I would love for you to choose to give your life to him in this moment. Before Christmas this year, get a big gift. What do you do? How do you do that? You need to pray in your heart, not to us. We are not the authority, God is. And so in your heart, I want you to, one, admit to God right now, God, I admit I have sinned. I admit it. And two, what do? You need to now pray this, God, I believe in your Son. I believe in his abundance. I believe in Jesus. And number three, I want you to say this, God, I choose to follow you. I'm done with my life on my own. I choose to give it to you. Teach me what it means to follow. Because God, you are worth it. You are fantastically glorious. We trust you a ton. Help us to trust you today. In Jesus' name, amen.